Well, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to pupils and staff to this webinar about Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. I'm Dr. Cameron Pike, I'm Deputy Master External at Dulwich College, and you're all very welcome. I've been asked to give a brief introduction, and I will be brief, but I'd like to start by saying it's very personal for me to introduce this because Beethoven was the composer who began my love of classical music. When aged 7, I listened to my father's record of the Fifth Symphony, which I still think is a truly remarkable work. Later on, as an historian, I wrote a book about Benjamin Britten and his friendship with Shostakovich, and that was very interesting as well because Britten, as a young composer, absolutely revered Beethoven. He then went on to reject his music totally on account of what he saw as the crudity of sound. Not so with Shostakovich, and that was brought home to me very strongly when Shostakovich's widow, Irina Shostakovich, showed me around his flat in Moscow, and in his study there's a huge bust of Beethoven, whom Shostakovich saw as the great universal artist. One of the most interesting essays I ever wrote at university answered this question: why does the music of Wagner sound different from the music of Mozart? And the answer to that is, of course, the Romantic Revolution. And I suppose Beethoven perhaps is absolutely core to that revolution. And Beethoven himself was indeed a revolutionary. He lived in an age of huge political ferment. And I think it's sometimes worth remembering that he's nearly an exact contemporary with that other revolutionary, Napoleon. Before I hand over to Dr. Carnelley, I just wanted to make two final observations for you. When I listened to the Pathetique earlier this week, what struck me was the extraordinary expressive weight that Beethoven places on the first movement. And that, I think, is something that he himself develops even further in some of his later works, the violin concerto and the extraordinary first movement of the Ninth Symphony. But let's not forget that then the later generation of Romantic composers take that further. I think of Mahler's Ninth Symphony, the first movement of that, and that other Pathetique Symphony, the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. I think the final thing I just wanted to say is this, that about 10 years after this piece was written, Jane Austen wrote a novel which I'm sure you've all heard of called Sense and Sensibility. And she tried to contrast the two, sense, if you like, reason, sensibility and feeling. And I think we often contrast those two things, you know, the age of reason, the 18th century, the age of feeling, the 19th century. But I think what marks this piece out to me as a truly great work is the fact that it actually combines the two. It's a highly crafted work of sense, but it's also an incredibly turbulent and passionate work of sensibility. So I really hope you enjoy the next 50 minutes, and I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Carnelley.
Hello. I am going to talk to you a little bit to start off with about the context of Beethoven's piece and also about the way he composed his music. So we'll be looking a little bit at his sketchbooks. There's Beethoven looking every bit the great composer, wild hair and a grim look. So what was the context of Beethoven's piece? Well, Beethoven, as we know, was a German. He was born in the city of Bonn, but in fact, the German culture covered the whole of what's now Austria and Germany. And because the center of power was the Habsburg Empire in Vienna, Beethoven soon moved as a young man to Vienna, and there he became known as a virtuoso pianist, someone with a brilliant technique and great technical skill. There were very few public concerts in Vienna in those days. Most of the public music was very limited. Mostly music took place in the houses of wealthy aristocrats and in the royal court. So to give an actual concert was a pretty unusual thing to do. And Beethoven, when he gave his most famous concert on the 22nd of December, 1808, actually packed the program with almost all the pieces he'd written to that date, or so it seemed. Benefit concerts were given to give a bit of financial reward to great composers or to great conductors, great impresarios. And many of the musicians gave their services for free to help the composer. In this case, we don't think Beethoven made very much money, because it was a huge resources involved in this concert, and the concert itself lasted for 4 hours. So he may even have been out of pocket at the end of that. The Pathetique Sonata itself was written between 1796 and 1799, as many of you will know. And it was around that time that Beethoven's hearing began to deteriorate. But I'm here to tell you what many people don't quite understand, which is that Beethoven's hearing he never lost his hearing entirely. He couldn't hear music anymore, which must have been incredibly difficult and tragic for him. But he could still hear if you shouted very loudly in his ear. So contemporary writers tell us. Now, the title of the Pathetique Sonata was not given to it by Beethoven himself. It was probably his publisher, but it's very important to this piece and why Edexcel are using it as a set work. The reason, of course, is pathetique means emotional and moving. And so here we see the seeds of the romantic movement. The turbulent nature of this first movement gives you a lot of clues about what romantic music was to be. Beethoven, therefore, is regarded as one of the great classical composers, along with Mozart and Haydn from the classical period. But on the other hand, he's one of the great romantic composers as well, because his later works were very much in the romantic style. The next thing I wanted to talk about was Beethoven's sketchbooks and how he can help you to compose your GCSE pieces. We study great composers for two reasons. Mainly because we enjoy playing their music and listening to it still, but also because they can teach us how to write our own music. We know that Beethoven spent months and often many years with individual ideas, developing them and expanding them until he felt ready to write an actual piece of music. He walked around Vienna, around the countryside, in the woods, and he sat in bars. And as he was doing that, ideas came to him and he'd write them down on individual sheets of manuscript paper. Now, after a few years, he had so many sheets of paper that they began to get very mixed up, lost, tangled, confused. And so he started to use sketchbooks, small pocket books that he could put in his pocket, carry around with him. And whenever an idea or a motif came to him, he'd write it down there and then. And there are now about 10,000 pages of these sketches surviving. Musicologists have divided these sketches into three different types. First of all, concept sketches. These are just brief ideas, perhaps a clef, a key signature, a time signature, sometimes a few chords, sometimes a bit of tune, sometimes just a written account of what the piece was to be. These are concept sketches. You also got synopsis sketches. These were where he elaborated and developed his ideas and possibly decided how to continue these ideas, put them into different keys, things like that. Finally, you get a continuity draft. This is a sketch which starts to place different sections of the piece together. So we can look at Beethoven's methods and use them when we compare our own books. So here are a few images. This is a concept sketch. You'll see that on Beethoven's sheet of manuscript paper, there are no clefs. Beethoven just seemed to remember those. But what there are lots of ideas for different sections of the Missa Solemnis. There are chords, there are rhythms, there are even a timpani roll there, and melodic ideas. So you've got the whole piece encapsulated on one page. This is a synopsis sketch, and we can hardly read it, but apparently what's contained within that sketch are the themes of the Eroica Symphony. Now, of course, not all the things he wrote down were used. Some of them were abandoned, some of them were never used. But amongst all of that scrawl, we get some themes from the Eroica Symphony. And again, we could do the very same thing on Sibelius or Logic, just write down ideas Things we might use, it might be a key change, it might be a chord sequence, it might be melodic ideas, but all of us need to do that to compose our own pieces. Finally, you would get a continuity draft. This is where Beethoven actually put together the different sections and rearranged them often many times to create a complete structure, a complete and satisfying whole. So this bit of continuity draft is from the final movement of the Moonlight Sonata. And I'm just going to ask Mr. Luis Parés, who you'll meet in a moment, to just play that one page for you. So there is just one page of one piece and a short section that was there amongst many, many other sheets of paper, which he would have put together to create his final score. And here we have a Beethoven finished autograph score. Only often it wasn't finished. Look at all the changes and corrections. His poor publisher had to take sheets of paper like this and somehow decide what was written down on that sheet of paper. Now, luckily with Sibelius or Logic or Cubase or any of those computer programs, we never get these scrawls anymore. We can create a complete score and rub out the bits that we don't want. But Beethoven just crossed them out and did that. So here we have an example then of a complete score, but Beethoven's fertile imagination means that he never quite finished it. He couldn't resist changing things at the last minute. Now, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Luis Parés, and he will play, tell us all about the evolution of the piano.
Hello everyone, and I just want to talk to you about how Beethoven's ideas developed and what sort of instruments he had at the time. So as you know, keyboard instruments had existed for a very long time in the shape of organs, and the harpsichord was created around from the 14th to 15th century. The harpsichord was emerging from all sorts of different keyboard instruments, and in that time the strings used to be plucked. But it was until the 1700s, and actually in the year 1700, when Bartolomeo Cristofori in Italy developed the first fortepiano, in which the keys used to move a hammer, and that hammer would hit the strings. It was the first time that was done, and what that did allow was to produce dynamics. Now, hence the name fortepiano, which is loud and soft, and now we just know it as the piano. At the beginning, the fortepiano had the hammers covered in leather rather than felt, which is what we use today, and it was a very quiet instrument. It could not produce such a massive sound as the modern instrument. But composers like Bach already knew the fortepiano. Even Silbermann, who was the main producer of German pianos, showed quite a few fortepianos to Bach, particularly towards the end of Bach's life. And Bach even became a seller. He was an agent for Silbermann, selling fortepianos. So that idea that sometimes you think in Baroque music that we don't use dynamics is not quite appropriate. But of course, we have to, when we play such music, we have to think about the instruments that were available at the time. The greatest development in the fortepiano and to the instrument that we have today is the creation of the iron frame. The iron frame is something that sits inside of the piano and that is able to hold all the tension in the strings. And those strings in a grand piano can hold up to 20 tones of force alone, and that's enough to lift something like 2 double-decker buses together. So you can imagine the amount of strength and the amount of tension that sits inside the piano. Beethoven was very well known for breaking strings and for trying to produce the largest amount of sound possible. And the quality of the instruments at that time, being so delicate, did not always kind of managed to support and to sustain Beethoven's strength. And you can hear in the Pathetique Sonata how, and when I play it a little bit later, how much strength there is in such instruments. The second greatest development of the piano, and this was a little bit later from Beethoven, was the creation of the double escapement, in which we are allowed, it is possible to play a key and repeat quite quickly. And I just wanted to very quickly show you, and don't do this at home, please, how the action of the modern piano works. So as you can see, when you press the key, there is a very complex action in here that lifts the hammer. The hammer hits the string, but most importantly, the hammer will rest at a lower position than where the strings are, so the strings can resonate. So you will be able to play, and the string and the hammers will sit back in order to allow for all the strings to keep resonating until you lift the keys. So this is just a very brief introduction to how the keyboard was developed, how the instrument that Beethoven used is kind of linked to today's instrument. And I will speak briefly about how you can actually compare this approach from the older instruments to the modern instrument later on. But I will pass over to Dr. Carnelley for the next section.
Now, at this moment, what you want to know is, what do Edexcel want you to tell them about the Pathetique Sonata? So I've called this little moment Beethoven and Edexcel. Not a very usual juxtaposition, but unfortunately that's how we have to think of this set work. So first of all, Edexcel want you to talk about each musical element that makes up the piece. So what do we mean by musical elements? This is where I hope you'll do a little bit of work in your classroom. These are all the terms that Edexcel use, and in fact musicians use, to talk about music. So just for a moment, amongst yourselves, just think about what answers you might give about dynamics, rhythm, texture, melody, or those words. What are the words? What do they mean? What are you meant to talk about under those headings? Well, I hope you've been telling your teacher lots and lots of answers to those questions. You've all had your hands up. Dynamics, of course, mean the volume, whether it's loud or soft. But more importantly, in exam answers, you are often asked, does it change? So if it's a 2-mark question, you don't have to say it starts loudly and then forget about the rest. You'd probably say it starts loudly and then it gets quieter, all the other way around. But that's dynamics. Rhythm, what are the note values used? Are they crotchets, quavers, minims? What other sorts of note values are used? Are there any dotted rhythms or triplets or syncopation? Under tempo and meter, the exam board want to know what the speed is, whether it's fast or slow, but if it changes. And also, what is the pulse? Are we counting in 2 time, 3 or 4? Is it simple time, 4/4 or 2/4, or is it compound time, 12/8 or 6/8? All those sorts of answers are expected. Under texture, we have some of the most tricky moments because most pieces, in fact, I would say all pieces, have a variety of textures. So you need to try and identify whether it's monophonic, polyphonic, or homophonic, the particular extract that you've been given, but also what the different layers of the piece are. So it's not just a question of one word, it's often saying what role different instruments are playing in the piece. Are they playing the accompaniment or the melody? And that brings, of course, onto melody. What does the melody do? What's the range of notes used, the tessitura? Does it leap between notes or is it smooth? And more correctly, therefore, is it a conjunct motion by step or a disjunct motion, which means by leap? The instrumentation is pretty obvious, but also, again, what role do the instruments play? Is it major or minor? Now, it could be something else. The other set works you have You will find some of them are atonal, or you might find that they're modal, places like the pieces like Afro-Celt, for example. Under harmony, you need to ask yourself, is the piece using simple chords, functional harmony, as we call it? So that's chord 1, 4, and 5, the tonic, the subdominant, and the dominant. Or are more interesting chords used? For example, the diminished 7th chord in this Pathetique Sonata. What are the cadences? They all come under harmony. Lastly, the structure of the piece. What's the plan? How many sections and what are they called? So what's going on in the Pathetique Sonata? Again, this is a moment for you in your class to see what you know or what you can remember or what you can see from the score that we've sent to you. First of all, dynamics. What sort of things could you say about dynamics? Well, here are some ideas. You probably talk about crescendos. This is the seeds of the Romantic movement. So there's a lot of dramatic contrasts in sound. There are also decrescendos. There are also sforzando notes, forced or accented notes. This is something the piano could uniquely do and the harpsichord couldn't. So Beethoven, of course, was making full use of these new capabilities of his keyboard instrument. He would also have quiet passages, and you'd also have very loud passages. Again, the piano forte, that's what it meant. There is also the forte piano marking. Now, this is quite unusual, fairly straightforward on some instruments, but on the piano, quite difficult to do. More an aspiration than a reality. Rhythm. What sort of things can you say about rhythm? Well, of course, there are dotted notes. There is some syncopation that takes place. There are some septuplets and sextuplets. If you look at the bottom of your first page, you can see these long runs of notes, and they're really a sort of form of decoration, and they're marked like that, 7 in the time of 1. The continuous quavers in the bass part, that's also part of the rhythm, so you might want to talk about those. Next, speed. Just think for a moment, what are the 2 main speeds of this piece? Well, I hope you've already worked out that the beginning, because it's written there, is grave, which means very slow. And then on the second page of your score, the speed changes to allegro molto e con brio, very fast and with vigor. So there are 2 speed markings, and there's a return of the grave section at the beginning of the development. Meter. And in this piece, there is actually a change of meter. So you need to know that, and the exam board will want you to be able to point that out to them. So the second, the allegro section is actually in cut common time, as it's sometimes called, or 2/2. So there's 2 main beats in the bar, that's simple duple time. But the beginning of the piece is in 4/4, common time. So again, you're counting 4 in the bar, and of course it's a lot slower. Texture. Texture is a very important aspect of any piece of music, and textures in the best pieces change all the time, and this is no exception. So we have chordal textures, that's homophonic texture, and that's at the beginning of the piece. We have some monophonic moments. You can see one again at the bottom of the page, and particularly around about bar 190, where you've got a cascading descending figure. Homophonic can also mean a texture in which there's a tune and an accompaniment. And if you look at the third page of your score, you will see that the tune is played in the left hand, whereas the right hand, whereas the left hand is playing chords. So that's a clear homophonic texture, a tune with an accompaniment. The other thing that appears in this piece is broken octaves. You can see those on the first page, and they create what the Edexcel call a murky bass. And I think really what Beethoven is doing is creating a timpani roll in the left hand. Broken octaves, it's a pedal point, but it's also this murky bass that creates a sense of drama within the piece. Finally, there are places where there are just two parts at once, so it's a two-part texture. Melody. Now, there are quite a lot of things you can say about melody, and here are a few. Pieces of the classical period are almost always use what we call periodic phrasing or balanced phrasing. And all that means is the phrase is a similar length, question and answer. So 4 bars question will be answered by another 4 bars, or 8 bars of melody will be answered by another 8 bars, usually with a cadence at the end. And that's how classical, either classical period, that is, classical period pieces were constructed. And here we find that in Beethoven's music. You also find sequences, the immediate repetition of a melodic phrase at a different pitch. You find arpeggiated parts of the melody where the melody outlines a broken chord. So the notes of a C major chord will be used to form a melody, for example. There are also a lot of motifs. Now, in a moment, Mr. Parés will talk to you about the way Beethoven develops his motifs. The most famous Beethoven motif, of course, is the notes at the beginning of the 5th symphony, pa 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 pum, and that is a motif. And that's very often the way that Beethoven constructed his movements. Other things you can say about the melody are talking about whether the themes are ascending or descending, whether the melody is disjunct, so it moves by leap, whether it's conjunct, where it's mainly moving by step, whether it's a scalic passage, very common in instrumental pieces, particularly the piano, and then chromatic notes. Notes in the melody don't belong, and there's a whole chromatic scale at the end of the first page, at the very end, if you look at your score. The other aspect of melody are ornaments, notes that decorate the main notes of the melody, and there they are. You'll find lots of these in this particular piece. The instrumentation, now that may seem simple. Of course, it's the piano. But in actual fact, you might want to talk about the range of Beethoven's piano, which is 5 octaves. You may want to talk about the sustaining pedal. That makes the music of Beethoven much richer. The harpsichord couldn't sustain notes. So again, it's a big feature of piano technique to use the sustaining pedal to create this rich palette of color. There's also, of course, the much increased dynamic range of a piano, which grew during Beethoven's lifetime. Also the use of different registers. That means playing at the top end of the keyboard to the right or the bottom end of the keyboard to the left, and the different effects you can create by doing that. Finally, of course, you may, if it's the essay question, want to talk a little about the history of the piano. Tonality. Again, this is very important in this particular piece. And when we talk about the structure of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, we'll find out that the keys used, major and minor, are very, very important throughout the structure of a sonata form piece. And also, of course, modulation, the changes of key that take place. We can talk about the harmony, and in particular, the diminished 7th chord, which is such a characteristic of Romantic music and begins to appear in music around this time. And that's a chord made up of minor thirds. There are also pedal notes, sustained or repeated notes on the dominant or the tonic. Cadences are also important, and all these 3 cadences appear in Beethoven's piece of music. And if you'll just hear an extract, you may be asked, what cadence does this section of the work end with? So in a moment, we'll move on to the structure of the piece. But first of all, I'm going to ask Mr. Luis Parés to play the opening introduction and first section of the piece, the exposition.
So just before I play, if you want to listen to some of the elements that Dr. Carnelley mentioned just now, and just to point out particularly about the diminished 7th, it just happens right at the beginning of the piece. And that chord will continue making a presence throughout the whole movement.
So that's the exposition of the piece. So what is it about this piece that's so interesting for us to study at GCSE? What's the structure of the Pathetique Sonata? Sonata form, as it's called, appears in lots of classical period pieces. And it's got three main sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. And what happens is, it's a musical journey. The piece begins in the home key, it goes on a little journey to the dominant, and then it often repeats that section again. Remember, no social media, no iPads, no phones. So you had to let the audience get the hang of the melodies, the tunes within the piece before you started to develop them. So the exposition is almost always repeated. So when you get to the development, it's a journey through lots of keys and lots of different textures and lots of different material, which then returns during the recapitulation to the home key. So it's a very satisfying form. It's not quite ABA, it's not quite AB, but on the other hand, it has these three sections where you begin, you go on a journey, and you come back. So just for a moment, do any of you know, just try and fill in the missing boxes from what you have there on the screen. Okay, so some of you who've already studied this piece will hopefully have been filling in what you actually get, what happens. So what do you expect to happen in the exposition? First of all, you get the first subject, that's the main tune, and that will be in the home key. Then you get a transition, a short section where the key changes, and the second subject will enter in a different key for variety. Finally, there'll be a small codetta, an ending. The composer doesn't want to fool you into thinking it's the end of the piece, but on the other hand, he needs to finish that section before you carry on or repeat the exposition. So then the development, as it says there, you have new material sometimes, and certainly developed material from the exposition. There'll usually be another transition to various keys. And in this piece, there's an octave figure that brings you back to the home key and the first subject. Then another transition to take you usually back to the home key if you're not already there, and then the second subject, and finally the coda. Now, the only thing is, of course, that Beethoven didn't necessarily stick to the rules. So what did Beethoven actually do? He did this. You can see, therefore, I think we'll go forward a slide. This is what you expect to happen. I might just say tonic key, the dominant, and then modulations, and then eventually back to the tonic key. What did Beethoven do? Not that. Now you can see on this diagram, you've got all the different keys that Beethoven uses. I wonder if you can spend a moment just working out what happens in the exposition. What keys are used in that one section that Mr. Parés has just played to you? Well, if you've got a very good memory, and some of you probably have, you'll know that the first subject is in the key of the piece, naturally, that's C minor. And then there's a short section in a different key, B flat major, to take you to the second subject. Now, this is where Beethoven is so imaginative and so fertile. In the second subject, instead of being in the relative major, E flat major, he puts us into E flat minor, a very startling and unusual key, which adds hugely to the drama of the piece. The second section, however, is in E flat major, as we expected all along. Finally, the E flat major is used for the codetta, which prepares us both for the first subject, but also at the end of the exposition for the second time, for the G minor of the slow introduction material to the development. Then there is more transitional material in E minor. There is the octave figure from the bass, which is in D major, and then some more G minor to prepare us for the return of the first subject, the main theme of the music, which is in C minor. Next, we get to the second subject, but instead of going to E flat minor, which would put us in a rather unusual place to finish the piece, he moves to F minor. Again, a rather unexpected moment in the piece, but that allows him to go into C minor for the second half of the second subject, which is the home key. And it's no surprise, therefore, that the whole piece then can end with the coda in C minor. So there you have the whole structure of the piece. And for the purposes of your exam, the main thing to take on board is the key of the piece and the unexpected modulation to E flat minor and the unexpected modulation in the recapitulation to F minor. I'm now going to hand you back to Mr. Parés, who will explain to you how the motivic relationships within the piece work.
So for your compositions, and what we usually find is that whenever you're trying to write a new piece of music, there's hundreds and hundreds of ideas that you have in your mind. And Beethoven was quite the expert on producing an entire piece out of a very small and very compact motif. And I'm going to prove to you now that everything I just played, and I hope you will have appreciated what a huge range of the piano was played, what a huge range of rhythms I played. Everything is developed from one single idea. And that idea is right at the beginning of this subject. So the melodic material that Beethoven will use is the consecutive seconds, which will happen all throughout the piece, but most importantly, divided into two sections. First, two consecutive seconds, and then one descending second. Now, that is the whole of the first movement of the Pathetique Sonata, and we can even venture even further and say that that same idea is also replicated in the second and in the third movement to a certain extent. But let's start with the first movement. So you have your grave introduction, you have the same rhythmic idea 4 times from bar 1 to bar 4. Same thing, and if you look at your scores with me, it will be very, very helpful. You go into bars 5, and then you immediately realize that the subject has now come back, but in E flat major. And even in this small, short interlude of passion, you can see that the bass line is the same thirds that are going down, and in the inner part of the right hand, you have the same third. And that idea will carry on. From bar 7 and 8, you will have the same idea of the second. And that is that's how he built this first page of the grave. One bit for your trivia, if you ever noticed, after in bar 10, when you have that chromatic scale, it is the first time in history, I believe, I've never found it in a book, but it's the only time I've seen it, where you can find a group of notes beamed with 5 lines. So you usually have semiquavers with 2 lines, demi-semiquavers with 3, and hemi-demi-semiquavers with 4. But you can see the last section of that chromatic scale has got 5. And the name for that, you just simply have to repeat semi at the start. So you have semi, hemi, demi, semiquavers for that. So that's one bit that may be interesting to point out. When you move into the main allegro section, you will notice that the main tune is made of 3 ascending seconds that derived from this time is inverted, repeated, and guess who's going to appear here? Your idea from the beginning, but this time inverted, and the final second in there. So you can see by changing the rhythm, but using the same melodic intervals, he has created a completely different idea, but that somehow is linked to the beginning. The transition section is a repetition of those intervals, and actually, pianistically speaking, is a really satisfying moment because you have the ascending second in the left hand. So you have an ascending second and a descending second in both in the hands, and that's repeated 3 times through the different key changes. And when you get to the second subject, this wonderful subject, of course, now if you listen to it carefully, you will have heard that already, because you have, and actually those notes are the inverted sequence of which you found at the beginning of the piece on the first subject. This second subject, incidentally, is going to be the main subject of the third movement, and how the third movement is going to start. And as you can see, it's the same idea of the second. And then your second subject on the second part of your second subject is an augmented realization of the first subject, because if you listen to the melody, it's exactly the same notes now. And that idea is the one that is replicated in there. And finally, in your codetta, you will have the same motivic idea as in the beginning. So you can see that actually Beethoven is using just one simple idea right from the beginning, and just to compose an entire piece by creating different rhythmic elements. The second movement happens to have the same story. If you have that's the beginning of the second movement, and it's actually the descending second, and then the 3 seconds in a completely new key. So as you can see, everything he did was related. The final thing I wanted to talk to you is about the range of the piano. So do not underestimate the amount of keys and the range of the piano when you're listening to these pieces. Beethoven was famous for using the entire range of the keyboard, and as Dr. Carnelley mentioned before, the keyboard of Beethoven had a range of 5 octaves. So if you look at the second subject, in the second part, when it's in the key of F minor, he's hitting the top note quite a few times, and although it is very dramatic in this piano, it would have had an extreme effect if had you played it in Beethoven's forte piano. And he was not only on my, so listen to that, and it just, on the main forte pianos, it just would have sounded absolutely as if I was playing on this complete range of the piano. He was also a revolutionary. This is the last idea I want to leave you with today before we proceed to a Q&A if you have any questions about this lecture. But Beethoven always wanted more. And in his, at this period of the time, when he was already writing for a piano of 4 or 5 octaves, sometimes that was not enough for him. And he wrote similarly, in pieces similar to this stage, notes that actually didn't quite match the harmony of the pieces just because he wanted that extra note. And that is a particular example on his first piano concerto, which was written, it started in 1795 but finished in 1801, so very much around the time of the Pathetique. And if you listen to the second subject, written in G major, the concerto is in C major, he wrote one note that we play today that Beethoven didn't have, and it's the most beautiful and the most beautiful expressive note, which is the stop of F sharp right at the end of the subject. But of course, in Beethoven's score, you only have, and so you can see that he already had a vision that somehow people would be able someday to play that F sharp. So I will pass over to Dr. Carnelley and to see if there are any questions about this lecture.
Okay, well, if there are any questions from the audience, we'll be very happy to answer those now.
What do we know about Beethoven's own piano playing?
Mr. Parés, what do we know about Beethoven's own piano playing?
Well, Beethoven was let me sit down in here with Dr. Carnelley. And Beethoven was an extraordinary pianist, actually. He was very proficient. He used to play quite a lot of his compositions, and he even premiered his piano concertos. So pretty much in the tradition of Mozart and Haydn, we can really see a very virtuosic pianist, in which and his compositions actually reflect pretty much the knowledge that he had of the instruments. If you look at the Pathetique as a compendium of 32 piano sonatas, it is one of the most important compendium of piano music ever written. It's pretty much there with Bach's 48 preludes and fugues. And the range of techniques that he developed as a composer and as a pianist on the piano, we are still using them today. And there's very few composers who managed to gain such a large range of composition and to manage to develop so much within his lifetime. So of course, he's that's why he's probably one of the greatest composers.
It looks as if we have another question for you, Mr. Parés. We are impressed that Mr. Parés is playing from memory. How long did it take to memorize this sonata?
Well, for me, I kind of have always had a very good memory, so that doesn't always kind of yeah, it's not very fair to answer, but I can memorize everything fairly quickly. However, there are certain pieces of music that I have struggled to memorize more. And I think it's a matter of repetition and just a conscious process of memory. Probably this piece, I memorized it within a few weeks, and I have played it many times as well. But the process of memory is very important if you are aiming at memorizing something, to ensure that you know, not only that you know the score inside out, not only the harmony, but the notes, how everything is moving also, and have a muscular memory, which is when you can just stop thinking about the music and just trust your fingers to do everything. That just comes with practice and repetition.
We now have another question from Chris Fish. Did Beethoven think about all the relationships between the sections and movements when he was writing his pieces? And I think I can answer that, because this goes back to the sketchbooks. I mean, it's quite clear that Beethoven did in fact think long and hard about his motifs and how he could develop them and expand them and what role they could play in each piece of music. And if you look through those sketchbooks, you can see how these melodic ideas, sometimes whole melodies, but often just short phrases, could evolve during the course of several years and then be combined into a piece. And again, the final sketches that he did would start to compile all these ideas and put them all into different orders. So I think it's certainly the case he was very conscious of the need to do this and how it works.
Great. So I think we need to wrap it up now. It's nearly 5 o'clock, and thank you so much for your questions, and
thank you for joining us.
And well, and hope this has been a useful session for everyone, and yeah, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you.
So it's goodbye from both of us.
And thank you to Katie Barretta from SSLP for all the work that she's done behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.